Hello and most welcome to 2013, and today I will speak once more about the interesting subject of language versus world, a subject that has interested philosophers, thinkers, scientists and neurologists, as in this case, for millennia. And I will in this list also include scientists who, especially in quantum mechanics, try to once more look upon the problem, but from the very angle of science itself. And I will read an article here from Brian Gibb, not of the Gibson brothers, and it is Brian Birdsell, From Computers to Bodies, looking for the architecture of language. The brain and computer are two everyday words for concepts that widely capture the imagination of so many people by their complexity and intelligent design, and have been bed partners in an enduring metaphor since the 1940s. These two concepts are so intricately interconnected in language and thought that it's hard to imagine one without imagining the other. For instance, the electrical currents of a computer are similar to the action potentials of neurons firing in the brain. When we talk about language, this metaphor gets further extended, whereby language becomes a computational process involving algorithmic codes, the syntax, manipulating abstract symbols, the words, into strings. These abstract symbols, such as orange, are hierarchically Start again. For instance, the electrical currents of a computer are similar to the action potentials of neurons firing in the brain. When we talk about language, this metaphor gets further extended, whereby language becomes a computational process involving algorithmic codes, the syntax, manipulating abstract symbols, the words, into strings. These abstract symbols, such as orange, are hierarchically connected to higher level symbols, for instance fruit, and to an array of semantic features. Sweet grows round. Indeed, this metaphor sparks the imagination, and some have even asserted that one day we might just be able to upload the mind into some computer, since the brain and the computer are essentially analogous. In fact, the New York Times covered this topic in 2015. With a piece called The Neuroscience of Immortality by Amy Harmon. Who detail the high-tech efforts required to accomplish this feat. This kind of thinking requires one to believe that the mind resides in the brain and that the brain is separate from the body, as in the Cartesian dualistic view of the mind and body. In contrast, it is more difficult to view the brain as a biological organ with cell tissue, cerebral arteries and veins, and able to grow by way of neurotrophic factors or decay, as in neurodegeneration. Moreover, it's difficult to think of the brain as being intricately linked to the body like any other organ. However, that the brain is an organ linked to the body is the perspective taken by theorists who follow an embodied view of cognition. This embodiment view gathered momentum in the 1980s and really became prominent in the early 2000s. This view rejects the computational view of the mind and instead argues that many processes, including language, are essentially grounded in the sensory-motor systems. That is to say, to use a term proposed by Michael Anderson, language developed as one form of neural reuse, a kind of cognitive piggybacking. In this view, there is no dedicated language module in the brain, in the way that Fodor or Chomsky imagine, but instead language processing is grounded in the sensory, motor, and affective system. Take, for example, Broca's region, which for a long time was viewed as being a dedicated language area of the brain for motor speech production. But researchers now contend that this region is also responsible for a number of other cognitive functions. Like active understanding and imitation. In short, an embodied view of cognition proposes that language comprehension involves widely distributed networks in the brain, and the words themselves provide cues to run a complex simulation. By recruiting the sensory, motor, and affective systems. Movement, odors, and tastes, the coupling of language to the body. Reading viewed as a high form of cognition compared to lower cognitive processes like perceptual or motor skills are often assumed to be detached from the motor cortices. Thus, reading is commonly thought of as a purely mental activity. Yet, an embodied view of cognition has questioned this very assumption. Take, for example, one of the earlier behavioral studies that clearly showed how reading involves running mental simulations that recruit the motor regions of the brain. In this study, Bergen and 2002, had participants judge the sensibility of sensible. For instance, open the drawer and nonsense, boil the air sentences. The sensible sentences were written in two ways: movement away from the body, for instance, I gave the pizza to Andy, and towards the body, Andy gave me the pizza. These participants then sat with the device on their laps. In this device had 3 vertically placed buttons for yes, no, and start. The start button was always in the middle. The independent variable in this study consisted of having the yes button sometimes away from the participants and sometimes closer towards the participants. Using reaction time as the measurement criterion, they found when the sentence and the action were congruent. I gave the pizza to Andy in condition 1. Reaction times were faster compared to when they were incongruent. Andy gave me the pizza. These participants then sat with the device on their laps. This device had 3 vertically placed buttons for yes, no, and start. The start button was always in the middle. The independent variable in this study consisted of having the yes button sometimes away from the participants and sometimes closer towards the participants. Using reaction time as the measurement criterion, they found when the sentence and the action were congruent. I gave the pizza to Andy in condition 1. Reaction times were faster compared to when they were incongruent. I gave the pizza to Andy in condition 2. They interpreted these results as suggesting that when we read a sentence like I gave the pizza to Andy, we are actually running a mental simulation that recruits the motor areas of the brain for moving the arm away from the body, like this. Therefore, in condition 2, the physical action of moving the arm towards the body in order to press the yes button closer to us contradicts this motor simulation and thus causes the slower reaction time. If the mind was processing language as an algorithmic computation, where language is completely disembodied or decoupled from the somosensitory and motor systems, reaction times would be the same. Researchers working within the framework of embodied cognition conduct not only behavioral studies, but also neuroimaging ones that use functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to better understand structural areas of the brain that become active during a specific task. Watching a YouTube video of someone doing an extreme sport like mountain biking along some crevice in the Canyonlands in Utah is probably enough to make the average person cringe, squint, and try to cling to something in order to maintain a sense of balance. Performing an action yourself and watching another person perform that same action are more intricately connected than once believed. Similarly, reading about kicking a ball and actually kicking the ball has been shown to activate the same motor control areas in the brain responsible for kicking. This motor cortex has some somatotopic map of the human body, and this map-like representation corresponds to different body parts. For example, at the dorsal part of the motor cortex, near the midline, there is the representation of the foot, knee and leg, and then extending to the lateral part, there is the arm and hand, followed by the face, mouth and ball example. In one early neuroimaging study that provided important evidence for an embodied view of language processing, the researchers had participants in an fMRI read a set of action-related words. These action verbs are associated with certain affectors or body parts that are used to enact that specific verb, e.g. kick, leg, lick, mouth, grab, arm, hand. When participants read these action verbs, the area of the motor cortex associated with that effector showed activation, which they interpreted as evidence for an embodied view of language processing. In following language instructions, the coupling of action, perception, and emotion with language is often neglected in the classroom due to 1. The belief that language is computational, disembodied, and thus learning vocabulary is like inputting codes into a mind's database, and body movement is unnecessary and perhaps even disruptive in the classroom. And or 2, the artificial environment of the classroom makes it extremely difficult to naturally couple language to the body. Yet, as pointed out in this article, there is an accumulating evidence to suggest that language is highly dependent on the body for semantic representation. The question then is, what can instructors do to bring the body into the language classroom? The premise of an embodied learning approach is that greater sensomotor learning engagement will lead to greater learning of language. As a consequence, the following are some practical considerations. One, provide learners with a rich multisensory learning environment that has the potential to leave behind experiential traces in the perceptual systems that can provide deeper encoding of the target language. This includes visual, auditory, tactile, and, if possible, even olfactory and gustatory stimuli. 2. Utilize an enactment approach in the classroom, especially when teaching highly action-related words such as manner of movement verbs, for instance stumble, skip. Such activities can help learners to retain their vocabulary. That is to say, instead of teaching these action-related words by linguistically explaining their meanings, have students enact them in the classroom. 3. Use gestures in the classroom for enhancing vocabulary retention, especially having learners themselves perform the gestures. Gestures like enactment have a facilitatory effect on learning vocabulary, as it provides learners a richer representation of the word by leaving behind experiential traces in the motor system. 4. Teach abstract language through metaphors by raising learners' awareness of the grounding of the metaphor to a concrete and embodied concept. This could be done through the use of visual metaphors, especially prominent in advertising and social awareness campaigns. For instance, the ecosystem is relatively abstract and difficult to grasp, so the World Wildlife Fund for Nature recently ran a social awareness campaign that blended the ecosystem with a game of Jenga. A game of Jenga is something that is experienced physically and that most people know, and through playing it have developed a deeper understanding of balance. This idea of balance then gets projected onto our understanding of ecosystems and how removing each block may result in the whole structure collapsing. So the distantly related concepts, the ecosystem and Jenga, share some semantic features and thus makes it a good metaphor. Becoming more aware of interdisciplinary research being done in the area of embodied cognition provides language instructors new perspectives on semantic representation in both the different levels of language, the abstract and the not so abstract. Such research can inform instructors about the importance of linking language to the body, and through enactment, gesture, multimodal learning, learners can deepen their knowledge of the target language. How the L2 semantic system is actually organized is still not very well understood, and likely highly dependent on the age of the acquisition, learning environment, and overall competency with the language. That said, from an embodied perspective, L2 learners likely acquire the language in an impoverished setting, as in a classroom, compared to an natural environment. For instance, in one study, Vukovic and Shtirov compared L1, that is first beginner language, first language, and L2 motor involvement during passive reading comprehension, and found that motor involvement was involved in both languages. But the L1 showed a stronger activation and involvement, which might reveal a shortcoming in the way we teach second language. They interpreted these differences as coming down to the reality that the L1 is learned in a diverse real-world context, as compared to the artificial context commonly found in a classroom. Thus, the L2 semantic representation is weaker and less rich. But there is a lingering question here for language instructors. Could this difference be affecting acquisition and retention as well? Further research has extended connections like these to the sensory systems. In everyday life, we take in an endless amount of input from our environment. For instance, when I cut garlic for my pasta sauce, I'm taking in sensory and motor information about the concept, garlic, which likely includes information about its shape, color, and most importantly for anyone who cooks with garlic, its odor. Later, when I come across the word garlic in writing or perhaps in conversation where the thing itself is not in my immediate environment, what kind of representational content provides meaning for it? Again, in a computational view, the meaning comes from the connections it has to other abstract symbols, divorced from the sensory-motor systems. Yet, in an embodied view, the meaning arises from recruiting those same sensory-motor systems that initially provided the input by way of running a simulation. In an interesting neuroimaging study by some researchers in Spain, they found that when people simply read odor-related words like garlic, lavender, cinnamon, etc., and even fart, compared to control words like coat, bell, and letter, they found a spreading activation in the olfactory system. They interpreted these results as suggesting that language processing recruits associated sensory information as well as a traditional language areas. In a similar study, a group of researchers extended this idea and examined whether they could find the same sensory neural reuse for gustatory words like chocolate, ham, pizza, etc. Again, they found that words with gustatory associations activate gustatory regions of the brain. These studies and many more similar ones provide evidence that when we read, hear, or even think about a word, we run a mental simulation. This simulation reactivates experiential traces in corresponding brain regions that were active during the initial interaction with that specific object, action, or event. This might include the sensory, motor, or affective systems. And this is really the heart of embodied semantics. Controversies. The problem of abstract concepts. The research so far primarily focused on concrete words that are tightly coupled to sensory modalities or action-related words, but as well as we know, a large part of language is abstract. That is to say, abstract words like democracy or honesty are not connected to any physical object or action in the external world, as garlic or kick are. How then do we understand abstract language, and how is it embodied? Take, for example, the following sentence from BYU's Corpus of Contemporary American English. The Killy-Hellers of Massachusetts wouldn't begin to know how to pack lightly. They are dragging around too much emotional baggage. And every summer they haul it all up to Maine, to the vacation home on the 3 acres of Cape Nedick. We all know that the sentence above is not talking about actual baggage that is being packed, dragged around, and hauled up to Maine for a summer vacation, but rather psychologically unpleasant past experiences. This complex and abstract psychological concept gets mapped onto this now entrenched idiom, emotional baggage. Why baggage, and why not a bookshelf? This is probably due to the fact that baggage has the affordance of something we carry or drag around, similar to these negative experiences in life. Therefore, one avenue of research in the field of embodied cognition argues that abstract language is grounded in a concrete way by way of metaphors. For instance, when we think about intimacy, we understand this abstract concept by mapping it onto our understanding of a physical source concept, such as closeness. Thus we can say something like, we are not very close. Despite the fact that we may be in close proximity to each other. But in this metaphorical expression, it refers to not having a social, friendly, and supporting relationship. Such metaphors often go unnoticed in everyday conversation, since they are highly conventional and entrenched in the language. Nevertheless, they are metaphorical and provide conceptual structure to our understanding of abstract ideas. We can say grasp an object, but also metaphorically grasp an idea. In expanding earlier research on the involvement of the motor cortex in processing of literal language, a group of researchers investigated whether similar involvement would also become active when those same action words were used metaphorically. For instance, we can say grasp an object, but also metaphorically grasp an idea. In their study, they used arm-related action word sentences along with leg-related action word sentences, e.g. kick the ball or kick the habit. They showed semantic activation in the corresponding motor regions, which is dorsal motor cortex for leg and lateral motor cortex for arm. When participants read silently, both literal and figurative uses of these action-related words, which they argue illustrates that abstract language is grounded in the sensory-motor systems by way of metaphor. Raymond Gibbs has also extensively studied the embodied effects of metaphor comprehension. Just to take one study by him and his colleagues, they had participants perform in the way of pantomime certain body movements, e.g. push, stamp, swallow, and then read metaphorical expressions that contain such movement. For instance, push the argument, stamp out fear, swallow your pride, and measure their reaction time for comprehending the sentence. They had 3 conditions: conducting an action matching the metaphorical sentence, 2, an action not matching the metaphorical sentence, and 3, no action. Results indicate that people performing the related results indicate that people are faster at comprehending the metaphorical sentences when the sentences are preceded by performing the related action. A second experiment extended this by showing that one does not need to actually perform the action, but simply imagine doing so to get similar results. That said, the main problem of a metaphorical view of explaining abstract words within an embodied framework is that it seems rather unlikely that it can explain all abstract words, since many are simply not metaphorical. Still, there is much controversy about abstract concepts within an embodied framework, and many suggest that instead of viewing language comprehension as fully embodied or purely computational and disembodied, it is more fruitful to view it in the light of gradations of sensomotor engagement. This pluralistic or hybrid view of embodied cognition seeks to incorporate some form of symbolic representation, especially through the use of a semantic hub within the architectural system of language. This hub, most likely in the anterior temporal lobes, acts as an integration area for semantic content binding and organizing the diverse semantic features of words. In short, there is still much debate concerning the semantic representation of abstract words. Grounding foreign language education, an example, bringing the body into the classroom. An embodied view of cognition, and particularly language processing, has had an enormous effect on how we understand language. Yet those working in the field of foreign language instruction might question whether or not the semantic representations in a foreign or second language is rich enough for embodied activations within the motor and somatosensory areas. This is especially relevant since most research has been conducted using the participants L1. In one study, a group of researchers investigated the associations between L2, that is second language learners. Sorry for the misunderstanding earlier. And the sensomotor systems for German-speaking L1 participants and participants who were English LT2 learners. In experiment 3 of their study, they examined whether or not simply viewing LT words that either had a spatially upward metaphorical mapping, e.g. happy is up, or downward mapping, e.g. sad is down, would facilitate hand movement in an upward or a downward way. To accomplish this, they had participants respond with an upward or downward hand movement to set a colored set of words that had emotional balance, either positive, happy, joyful, or negative, e.g. sad, depressed. Participants were told to ignore the meaning of the word and only consider the colors. The participants began with their hands pressing down 2 middle buttons. Then they would see a word on the screen, and depending on its color, they were to lift the right hand and move in an upward direction to press the top button, or move the left hand in a downward direction to press the bottom button. Despite the meaning of the word being irrelevant to the task, positive words facilitated faster upward movement, and negative words facilitated faster downward movement. Thus, the researchers concluded that the metaphorical meaning of L2 words is processed automatically. Even in a second language learner, and has a facilitatory effect on the motor system. That is to say, when we read words with a positive emotional balance, this cues the motor system in a spatially upward direction, and such effects also appear in second language. So this is pointing to the very close connection between our actions and words, and also into the interesting fact that until the year 2000, very little, if any, research was done in the area. We still were very pretty much stuck in the Cartesian dualism that has reigned for 2,500 years in the Western Hemisphere. And this is a healing, salutogenic move, I would say, going in a direction that heal our systems and also heal our world. It has beneficial things only to go with it. And it's also easy now to pinpoint the opposite, what a disbonded take on the world leads to. It leads to constant failures, misunderstandings, oppositions, failures, lack of predictive power if the words themselves and pretension are bodily things. We do not properly train those skills anymore. And by lacking the power to understand the words and the actions that we have at hand, we will also lack ability to understand our own world. And I would say we're lacking, we don't have the body, and we're not firmly situated in a balanced way. How we move about and having this positive upward direction. That positive upward direction is understanding itself. And without it, I fear little understanding, if any, can be possible. And this is also something that we looked at into some detail with Diego Lucio Rapoport, who showed that interpenetration and expenetration is absolutely necessary to have any definitions, distinctions, differences in the world. And of course, not understanding that, not having that knowledge until 2000, as was the case in neurology and research within that area, leads to a no understanding and have led to new understanding. We are most definitely stepping on a new path, a path that will take us to a wholeness of our shattered, fragmented world. A wholeness we've been waiting for way too long, I would say. Way too long. Now it's coming, and it's most definitely coming within neurology. Echoing exactly the same message, but put in such an far away abstracted language that it wouldn't yield understanding. And that is quantum mechanics of the 20s. Now we are pushing forward. Now we're coming to an embodied understanding of our deeply connection with the world. The world is not something out there, in the same way that our mind, our psyche, our understanding is not something in there. How you position yourself decides to 100% how much you understand and are able to partake in that fantastic, I would say, buffet that language is. It's a smorgasbord of richness. And now has come our time to retake that, to make it ours once more. I'll put a pause here and I continue with the next